Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Retro Renaissance podcast. I'm your host, as usual, Austin Newton. And in this episode, or possibly even series of episodes, we'll see how long this is by the time we get to the end of it, we're going to be talking about the sexual revolution. And there's a very specific aspect of the sexual revolution that we are going to look at, which is contraception. Contraception has been around for a long time. Actually, doing research into this topic, I realized that as far back as I believe Aristotle and some of the famous philosophers, there were herbal methods of creating spermicides that were, meant to prevent males from impregnating other women and that sort of thing. And then as the years progressed, there were sort of more innovations in the area of contraception. And then by the time you get to like the late 1800s, you have things like the condom or the diaphragm or the sponge or these sorts of things. But then laws sort of change within the United States specifically, and a lot of that comes with a higher price tag. And we'll talk about that as the episode goes along. But why is it that we're focusing in on this? Well, there's a lot of issues that we have, interestingly, both from the biological perspective and then also from the social perspective due to the pill. So just to give you kind of a quick rundown, things like changes in selection methods and dating norms, changes in levels of attraction to, say, the partner that you've chosen. It's caused shifts in the economy due to things like increased labor force and more people that are out there able to work. It's also, and I'll kind of show this as we go through, created less stable homes for what few children are being born each year. So to really dive into this, let's kind of talk about contraception in and of itself, sort of pre-contraception, post-contraception, that sort of thing. So let's go to pre-contraception. And what I mean by pre-contraception is kind of before a lot of the more modern forms of contraception, like the condom or the diaphragm or those sorts of things are known. You really don't have that many measures once you get into a serious relationship, once you get into a marriage, that you can use to control whether or not you have children. It's kind of more like a natural process of biology. And of course, if you're going to initiate acts of intimacy like you typically would, that's kind of like a common consequence is that you're going to have kids. And then you have kids, but you have this really solid structure of marriage and a really strong household to raise those kids in. And so you're teaching them core values, and you're teaching them things like responsibility and strength and wisdom, and you're teaching the girls all the skills that they know to be great homemakers and be great cooks, and you're teaching men a lot of the skills that they need to be great farmers and great providers, and et cetera, et cetera. And there's a connection between marriage and having children where you can't really talk about one without the other. And so the goal is for you to find someone that's going to be really suitable, not only as someone for you to sit down and talk to and to share interests with, but also to inevitably raise a family of strong children with, right? And so as soon as you are of a certain age, it's kind of like, oh, well, it's now time to court. And it's time to go out and meet people and to look for that person that's going to be your special partner that you're not only going to spend the rest of your life with, but that you are also going to share children with. Okay, and then the contraceptive method comes along, and now you have a little bit more choice, but there's still a lot of sort of social pressure on you to do the norm at that time, which is, to get married before you have kids. Now, obviously, you have these situations, young teenage lovers, they can't resist themselves, they end up having a kid before they get married. Maybe there's a bit of animosity in the parents, or maybe there's sort of like a feudal situation going on, something kind of like a Romeo and Juliet, if you want to imagine that. And, as soon as the kids have this kid together, it's like, well, what's the automatic thing to do? You use the social tool of shotgun weddings. Because the idea, again, marriage goes hand in hand with having kids. And if you're going to have kids even before marriage, then you have to get married to not only display honor towards that party that you've now gotten pregnant, but then to also just kind of make sure that those children come first and that what they need is supplied by your relationship. And You might say, well, why is it that you just can't have cohabitation? And that's something that we'll certainly get into later on. There's some interesting statistics along with that we can get into. But so that's kind of like the structure of norms and biology before contraception. Post-contraception, and this is kind of like more leaning into the hormonal interventive-based contraception, like the progesterone version that we know of today. Contraception sort of shifted not only the way that relationships are sought after and that they are built and that they ultimately progress, but it also changes our biology, which then influences all of these other factors that go into, like the kinds of jobs that we have, the kind of relationships that we get into, the people that we find attractive, and so on and so forth. So to kind of fast forward from the late 1800s, I'm thinking like 1875, 1880, somewhere in there, the hormone is discovered in, I believe, something like 1925, 1921, somewhere in there. In the early 1900s, we discovered that humans have this thing that is put off to initiate certain biological processes almost automatically. In about 1945 was when we start to see the first steps towards the current method of using hormone interruption for contraceptive methods. There was a Harvard endocrinologist named Fuller Albright, and he wrote a report where he detailed some research that he had been doing in a procedure for ovulation prevention using what he called, quote, birth control hormone therapy. And then a few years later, not even 10 years, by about 1951, Margaret Sanger, who is very closely linked with the onset of progesterone-based birth control methods, secured a grant from Planned Parenthood, which was kind of just to get money to test the use of progesterone injections as a contraceptive method in animals. So just like a lot of drugs that we have on the current market today, lab tests are done before they're given human clinical trials, and this typically occurs on mice or on rabbits or some type of animal that maybe we don't necessarily think of so much as like high ranking, and certainly not like cats or dogs or that sort of thing. And you could get into a whole debate on whether or not you can look at those animals as pets and where the line is. But I digress. Anyway, the initial funding that was given by Planned Parenthood, because the FDA certainly wouldn't fund this, was to look into these injectable methods of contraception. So we were kind of getting away from more materialistic ways. However, there were some other researchers around the time, like Frank Colton, who was a chemist, and he independently developed the first oral form of synthetic progesterone. So once that was in hand, there was almost kind of like a race between he and Margaret Sanger's version, which that version also came from another researcher whose name escapes me at the time, but there was kind of like a rush to see who could get that developed and put on the market the quickest. And Colton didn't have nearly as difficult of a time getting funding from the FDA to do trials on this. And there's something we really need to look at before going any further with this, which is Comstock laws. So in the late 1870s, I believe it was, contraceptive methods were banned, essentially. So the use of contraception to try to keep you and your spouse from having kids was illegal. And over the course of decades afterwards, there were some shifts in the ideology of that, some shifts in the legislation, and so it kind of broke from being a federal level thing to being a state level thing. And so each state kind of developed its own interpretations of these laws and whether or not it wanted to uphold them and that sort of thing. And so by the time that Colton and the FDA started to do trials on this synthetic progesterone pill, there are still some states that do have Comstock laws. So Massachusetts and Connecticut are a couple of notable states, basically where the the selling of these types of pills would be illegal. And there's some interesting things to note, like after the funding got picked up and after some of these pills went through all of the process, got cleared for human trials, and then finally made it out on the market in small doses, like maybe 10 milligram, which, I mean, from what I understand, the milligrams got a little bit lower as they released more of them. So you went from like 10 to 5 to 2.5 or something like that. But when the first initial dosage came out, that these states weren't offering them, but some of the medical practitioners that were high ranking on a lot of boards. So, for example, there was a Yale practitioner on one of their medical boards that was invested in giving this choice to women, both married and unmarried. And so he kind of went against the Comstock laws in that state and opened up roughly 6 Planned Parenthoods, or petitioned for the opening up of 6 Planned Parenthoods, him and some other collaborators. And they were, of course, arrested and put on trial, and this made its way all the way up to the Supreme Court, which is what got President Eisenhower and some other notables on the Supreme Court to really look at this and kind of brought it into the view of national recognition.